Well, here we are, the Diaries of Mr. George Lucas, almost 60 volumes from 1948 to 2009, chronicled in these little notebooks. They're sort of like relics in themselves, just challenge duplicate book. January the 1st, 1948. This is the first diary entry that we have from George Lucas, who at this point is 21. Investigate socks prior to kit check. Caught the 726 to Sidcup and heard Mass said very well by an English priest. My shoes are now so leaky that I am compelled to have them repaired, so I must wear boots tomorrow. Tant pis. The weather is unpleasant, mild, warm and very damp. The most unhealthy type of January weather. Thousands and thousands of entries in this tiny spidery writing. Sort of punctuated with newspaper clippings, usually concerned with something about celebrity or the weather or the current state of sexual litigation in the country. The fragments of a life. I'm looking at a picture of him now with his Arthur Lowe spectacles, and then various pasted in pictures of guardsmen that he knew. It's really an extraordinary thing. It's like a gay Tutankhamun. June 15th, 1958. I had 10 minutes sex with Bobby Rose this afternoon. A sordid episode I regret. Sex with someone I don't like and who is, in any case, coarse, selfish and grasping is not pleasant. Mr. Lucas spent almost 70 years paying for sex. Guardsmen, rent boys and Irish layabouts. His life as a gay man at the margins of straight society was spent at the heart of queer Britain, but not so much the bars and private clubs. His world was more in the twilight, the public lavatories, the late-night parks and beach promenades. Home after taking a look at Sidcup Park, the first time I've ever seen it. The public convenience there has some interesting graffiti. With the pay corps in Sidcup, it might repay a visit one evening. During his working life, Mr. Lucas was a civil servant, employed at the Board of Trade in London's Whitehall. He died in 2014 at the age of 88, leaving behind his diaries. Page upon page, millions upon millions of words. Today, Mr. Lucas's diaries belong to the writer and journalist Hugo Greenhalgh, himself a campaigner in the 1990s for the case to equalise the gay male age of consent. So, Hugo, how did you come to own the diaries?
It's a bit of a long story, but I was employed as a researcher on a documentary about male prostitution back in the mid-90s. Mr. Lucas came forward and said, yes, I've been buying sex and paid for sex for many, many a year. So round I went to talk to him.
And where was he living when you first met him?
He was living in a maisonette, upstairs maisonette in Clapham, just close to Clapham Park. And there I found Mr. Lucas, surrounded by his diaries.
He wrote about everything in sort of obsessive detail. And was your meeting amongst his diaries?
Everything was noted down, including the first time I met him as well.
Instant archiving.
He recorded everything. It was Tuesday, September the 6th, 1994.
In Capital Gay, I noticed a brief reference to a research study on male prostitution, whose researchers asked sex workers and their clients to get in touch with them. The interview lasted 2 hours. Hugo Greenhalgh is a good-looking, dark-haired young man in his early 20s, well-spoken, who asked few questions and let my recollections and reminiscences flow out. Greenhalgh's response to my initial, "Would you like a drink?" was that he'd
love a coffee.
And I was amused to see that, like everyone else I make coffee for, he left it untouched after the first sip. I've offered him the use of my scrapbooks of newspaper cuttings, and he says,
"Filming begins in October. Would you mind appearing on screen?"
'Tis almost tempting, but in ordinary prudence, I must say I wouldn't. If they want my reminiscences spoken, they must have an actor, not me, to speak them. It was obviously a challenging time to live so openly as Mr. Lucas did, but do you think he was comfortable with his sexuality, or was he ashamed?
I think it's a mixture of the two there, really. He was quite open, certainly to himself and several others as well, about being not just homosexual, but also being gay. He used the word gay very early on in the diaries, in the 1950s, which was very rare. But there is also a mixture of, well, really kind of shame and torment, such as this entry here on March the 1st, 1948.
The homosexual concupiscence is a very dreadful malady, a species of moral leprosy of a peculiarly revolting kind. Since the carnal gratification it requires is not merely contrary to ordinary morality and loathsome in that respect, but contrary to human nature. And so, doubly abhorrent, 'tis a sad disease that can turn one who by day is a respected and useful official into a furtive night prowler, driven by dark lusts till the fit has passed. Born on June 16, 1926, Mr. Lucas grew up in Chadwell Heath, a small suburb of Romford, east of London. His was a typically lower middle-class upbringing. Not poor by any means, but one in which the pressures of little money exacerbated the tensions between his constantly warring parents, Edmund and Joanna. An only child, he attended West Ham Grammar School, where he was badly bullied. His sexuality became evident to his parents in 1942, when Mr. Lucas was just 15. The exact details remain unclear, but his father constantly returns to the young Mr. Lucas's attempted seduction of a house painter. And throughout his life, Mr. Lucas's diaries tell us that his constant search for companionship would land him in trouble. May 2nd, 1948. I was awakened by my father shouting, "I want him to lose his job. I want him dragged down as low as he can be, the homosexual." This, in view of later events, was an ironically appropriate speech. And unless God once more intervenes miraculously, I am ruined and my career blasted. My hopes gone, name, reputation and future destroyed. After lunch, I went to Raphael Park, where I met judgment in the form of a police constable who took my name and address and demanded my identity card. I imagine he means to charge me with either loitering with felonious intent or indecent exposure. Either charge might stand. If I am charged, I am ruined and will face instant dismissal from the War Office. My father will exult over my downfall. Meanwhile, until arrest or summons, I must go about my business with as good a heart as I can muster. June 6th, 1948, Sunday. I received today a very terrible shock, being informed by my mother that Mrs. Strutt, the fat woman next door, that is a clerk in the police station, had seen my name on a charge sheet, the charge being indecent exposure. 'Tis true. 'Tis pity, and pity 'tis true. This is dreadful. As I went out this morning, my mother remarked sweetly, "Pray to St. Joseph." I inquired why. "To make you pure," she replied. The charges are eventually dropped, but the diaries introduce us here to his parents, very much people of the age. His mother, Joanna, is a staunch Irish Roman Catholic, and his father, a rabid atheist. So they are quite spectacularly ill-matched, and religious war flares regularly at home. Mr. Lucas is often caught in the crossfire, not least as both are very aware of his sexuality. Entry after entry details the daily abuse he endured until he finally left home in 1954. This morning's crop of abuse from my mother included such gems as, "Why don't you jump in the Thames or put yourself under a bus, you perjurer? You've let me down and your uncle and the civil service and the church." She also told me, "I hate you because you're a homosexual, not for any other reason." On my return from Mass this morning, I was greeted by my nasty old father with a sneering, odd collar he's wearing, and his trousers up so high you can see the crack of his arse, the dirty, stinking homo masturbator. I know what he gets up to behind locked doors in the bathroom. My mother, in a savage humour, and asking me as I shaved why I didn't draw the razor across my throat and end it. She cooled later.
A product of his Catholic upbringing and ultra-conservative parents, Mr. Lucas is very much an old soul trapped in a relatively youthful body. He is a shy, somewhat introspective young man, very conscious of his receding hairline, parted in the middle much to the amusement of his mother, and when he ducks their brickbats, they take glee in screaming at each other.
I arrived home to find my mother and father shouting and grimacing at each other because the coal was not in. She suddenly snarled at me. If you were a man, you'd punch him in the face. I resented this and said so, and a flood of the most filthily malignant abuse was poured out of me. You humpy-backed old homo, you filthy toad with a filthy, disgraceful past. You ought to be down on your knees to me. You've got no gut in you. Then to the cat. That old homo made me forget to give you your milk. She continued to croon endearments to the cat and make filthy allegations of sexual immorality against me, while her husband snarled and gibbered to himself in another room.
Bloody hell. God, it's monstrous. Mr. Lucas would find himself on the wrong side of the law again over the next few years. Just after the Second World War, he finishes national service and signs up to the army. But sent to Germany as a commissioned officer, he finds that gay liaisons are not so easy to come by as they are in Britain, and those that are fraught with danger.
October 18th, 1950. For a walk about Dusseldorf this afternoon. Tea at Carlisle House, and so back at 6 p.m. via Cleverplatz. At 6 p.m. I was a useful and respected staff officer taking a walk. At 7 p.m. I was under arrest for an alleged indecent assault offence with a young German who reported me. So my career as an officer comes to an end, sordidly.
Grab your coat and get your hat. Leave your worries on the doorstep. Just direct your feet to the sunny, sunny side of the street.
November 20th, 1950. Today I was tried before a brigadier and 4 other officers. A very shattering ordeal, in the latter part of which I felt sick and ill. The prosecution was fair. My defending officer, though he bungled his job, was at least immoderately convincing. Yet the court found me guilty and sentenced me to be cashiered and to serve 6 months' imprisonment, which I had not expected.
Mr. Lucas spent 3 months confined to barracks in Germany under arrest, but in January 1951 his sentence is reduced to a simple dismissal from the army, and so he returns sheepishly to home in Chadwell Heath, terrified his parents will uncover what really happened in Germany.
February 9th, 1951. I learned this morning that since the first day of my return here, my mother has known of my situation. She, of course, was up to her old trick of reading a private diary and acquired a good idea of what has happened. I don't know which to marvel at most. The contemptible slyness of a woman who reads a diary and opens envelopes, as she did this morning, or her duplicity in keeping silent until now.
But all is not lost. Whilst Mr. Lucas has been dismissed from the army and his position in the War Office, the Civil Service says it will provide him with a job, provided, as he writes, that no other official has ever been dismissed for my type of crime.
May 17th, 1951. Now that the dark cloud that has overshadowed me for 5 months has been, by God's mercy, rolled away, I find myself established in London as a Board of Trade official, with a past known to only a small circle, and a reputation not seriously damaged by what would have ruined that of many another man.
With his job safe and a steady income, Mr. Lucas returns once more, with vigour, to London's thriving underground gay scene.
August 7th, 1951. This evening I met the two soldiers from the Highland Light Infantry, both in kilts, and spent the evening with them in a tour of various bars. One, Private Kesson, is a stocky lad from Paisley with a lively sense of humour, a comical little face, and considerable sophistication. The other, Private Craig of Berwick-on-Tweed, is taller, quieter, and will probably end up as a Marble Arch layabout. Kesson's clientele includes Michael Redgrave, the film actor. I returned to Clacton considerably intoxicated, more so than I have been for a long time, and reeled to bed feeling decidedly ill. December 16th, 1951. Having withdrawn myself to a great extent from the homosexual circles of Marble Arch and reverted to my pre-1950 situation, I am rather happier. Being free and unattached, and with 2 years more experience as well, I can pursue my hobby of succouring and solacing young soldiers, Welsh for preference, and, if possible, deterring them from yielding to the solicitations of the fouler sort of homosexual.
Yes. Mr. Lucas's diaries from the 50s and 60s record the comings and goings of the many men in his life. The amount of money he pays them for sex, their preferences and performance, all recorded in detail. And unsurprisingly, they also record the gossip of the day, the politicians, pop stars and actors who swing both ways. Many have to live double lives, photographed with wives or girlfriends to keep an acceptable public image. But then, several high-profile scandals hit the front pages of the newspapers that will eventually change a law that has sent hundreds of gay men to jail.
October 16th, 1953. This morning's news is that my Lord Montague of Bewley, now in the USA, has a warrant out against him for homosexual dealings with Boy Scouts. I had suspected as much. Colin has already noted him as a practicing sodomite. October 21st, 1953. I see that John Gielgud, the well-known actor, was today fined £10 for importuning in Chelsea. The Home Secretary, Sir David Maxwell Fyfe, has begun a vigorous war on homosexuals. Severe sentences, greater police vigilance, bitter abuse are the weapons, and the newspapers are whooping on the hunt with savage glee. December 16th, 1953. Today, Lord Montague was at Winchester Assizes, acquitted of a charge of sodomy, very properly. But on a charge of indecent assault, the jury could not agree. So on this count, his trial is put over to next assizes. I trust that he gets clear. In 1954, Lord Montague was arrested and convicted of conspiracy to incite certain male persons to commit serious offences with male persons. He always maintained his innocence, but was sentenced to 12 months in jail. It was the first time this charge has led to a conviction since the Oscar Wilde trials of 1895. The Montague trials and other high-profile cases had one beneficial effect: the establishment of what came to be called the Wolfenden Committee, under the leadership of academic and former public school headmaster Sir John Wolfenden. In 1957, its long-running report, 3 years in the making, recommended that homosexual behaviour between consenting adults in private should no longer be a criminal offence. Mr. Lucas followed its progress.
Sir John, what about the large section in this report which deals with homosexuality? What are your recommendations, the recommendations of your committee in that section?
What we've done, or what we've recommended, is that adult consenting males in private should not have their behaviour in this matter brought within the criminal law. In fact, that they should be taken out of the criminal law.
Which would be a major change in the law, of course.
Which would be a major change.
And what about, then, the protection of young people, the protection of youth? What about under 21?
Well, of course, if either of the partners in an act of this kind were under 21, it would still be a criminal offence if our recommendation were accepted.
27th November 1958. There was a long-awaited debate on the Wolfenden report tonight in the House of Commons. A very mild and exciting affair it proved to be. Homosexual emancipation, like Catholic emancipation, will come gradually, after more than one parliamentary setback. But I think it will come in my lifetime. Mr. Lucas's hesitancy was astute. While there appeared to be a push to change the law and signs that some in society were becoming more tolerant, there was still plenty of hostility towards homosexuals, especially from the police. A man trying to extort money from our diarist in Trafalgar Square simply presumes Mr. Lucas would not turn to the authorities for help. He followed me into the post office, Mr. Lucas writes, on October 31st, 1961. And when I threatened to tell a policeman, the man sneered, "Someone in your position wouldn't want a court case," which is painfully true. Still plagued by this Queenie-looking man, I plucked up my courage and, going onto the square, did approach a policeman and asked him to get rid of this man. The policeman's manner was cold and distant. He told me in a distinctly hostile manner that I was to go back to the office. And so I arrived at my room, white-faced and shaking. It's not surprising. No homosexual can be in contact with police without fear and trepidation. Despite whispers of change on the horizon, the first half of the 1960s was a dangerous time to be gay or bisexual in Britain's capital.
Barrett, if I hear from you again, I shall inform the police. Do you understand? That's absolutely final.
September 9th, 1961. The film Victim had its premiere last week. It deals with the blackmail of homosexuals vulnerable under the present law. It is the first film explicitly dealing with homosexuality to be screened in England, with the romantic Dirk Bogarde as leading actor, or leading lady, as everyone in the know would say.
They're going to call me filthy names. My friends are going to lower their eyes, and my enemies say they always guessed. I don't want you a part of that Roman holiday. I love you too deeply for that.
It has been most enthusiastically reviewed and seems likely to do a great deal to educate the public in the right direction. I was pleased to see someone from the Homosexual Law Reform Society handing out pamphlets to the first night queues. Inevitably, and of necessity, the script contains much pleading of the "we ought to be pitied, not blamed, nature has played us a dirty trick" sort. This is, at present, the only possible line to take to win friends and influence people, but I don't really think it's true. The homosexual has as much sexual fun as the man who likes girls, without any of the difficulty or the expense, or the risk of awkward consequences. We know Mr. Lucas would pick men up at Marble Arch or around Piccadilly Circus. He would also drop into a number of pubs such as the White Bear, the Welsh Harp, and this one, the Golden Lion, on Dean Street in Soho. Hugo, how often did he come here?
Well, reading the diaries, it seems like almost every night.
February 20th, 1961. A drink with Willie Davidson this evening in the Golden Lion, the gay pub I detest. Its atmosphere of sleaziness, brassy coarseness and rent puts my teeth on edge. So why did he keep coming back? Who would he meet here?
Well, he'd come in here usually after work. He'd leave the Board of Trade and head across St James's Park to Soho. And he'd meet the usual range of barflies. This is pre-internet, pre-mobile phones. He would just turn up, and you'd have this incredible range of characters, from guardsmen, from rent boys, from layabouts, to some names like Dan Farson, who was a bit of a kind of 1950s TV star.
Oh, yes.
And then you also had these wonderful, again, barfly acquaintances. Whether they're friends or not is debatable. People like Woodbine Jack, Tokyo Rose, and the wonderful but wonderful Mr. Nice.
April 15th, 1963. Old fat Charles Nice is an intolerable nuisance at times with his phallomania. When I am told, as tonight, that such a one has got a nice piece of meat, or a big packet, or a huge chopper, my interest in the young man is at once quenched, however attractive in features or conversation. And was he here for the beer, or was it just to catch up on the gossip?
Well, it wasn't the beer, but it definitely was the gossip. But it was also for the guardsmen, basically, who used to flock here in the 1950s to earn their 15 shillings from punters like Mr. Lucas to go out later that night with their girlfriends.
February 22nd, 1969. The Golden Lion was very crowded. Mr. Nice was in talk with a little group of guardsmen from the 1st Scots. There were 2 plainclothes Special Investigation Branch men standing across the road from the Golden Lion, watching the talking and pairing off on the pavement that follows closing time. I tried to persuade Mr. Nice not to walk off with his 2 guardsmen under their noses, partly because I wasn't sure how safe either party was, partly because one of them had already indicated he expected to be taken up by me, but to no purpose.
As the police clampdown intensified in the 1960s, Mr. Lucas reports time and time again that the police are out in force, and every cottage or public lavatory seems to have been visited by a pair of good-looking policemen at least twice a week.
January 20th, 1961. Piccadilly Circus is lousy with plainclothes police these last few days, and 5 of those on the game have been arrested so far. It is galling to think that police, who are so well paid out of our taxes to preserve life and property, should devote themselves to the easier task of prosecuting harmless people. And male prostitutes, if not exactly the best type of young men, are harmless enough. They are socially useful. How else would the old or ugly comfort their flesh and calm their minds if venal young men were not available?
There were a handful of allies in Parliament and the Church of England who wanted to help bring about a change to the laws and reduce the stigma of homosexuality. But there was little in the way of protest or direct action to fight the cause. For the most part, the campaign was started by a somewhat quieter and more respectable organisation called the Homosexual Law Reform Society. It was led by a sober, serious man called Anthony Gray, talking here to Radio 4 in 1998.
The West End clubs were frightfully respectable. I mean, everybody wore collars and ties and were very discreet and rather proper, you know. There wasn't any of the sort of open flirting and goings-on that there is now. The best was sort of a bit of very discreet knee-touching or putting an arm around somebody at the bar, and that's as far as it ever went in all the little West End clubs in the 50s.
Anthony Gray would travel the country talking to as many clubs and groups as he could to persuade them that his lifestyle posed them no threat and why he believed the law was wrong. As he recalls, meetings of the Mothers' Union were surprisingly open-minded.
They had never consciously met a homosexual in their lives. They had no idea what homosexuals did or how they felt or anything. And I honestly believed, you know, if I'd gone to a Mothers' Union and said, well, you know, confidentially, what homosexuals do, they eat babies, they would have accepted it because I was the expert. I mean, the funny thing about Mothers' Unions was they were really quite anxious to be sympathetic because they were, you know, it was dawning upon them, thanks to the activities of some of the agony aunts, that they might have gay sons or nephews or brothers. I mean, gay husbands and fathers were still taboo, but we did talk about the sons and the nephews people. And it was always very noticeable. They would sit very nervously at the edges of their chairs in the first minute or two of my talk, and once I'd uttered the dread words buggery and gross indecency and so on, they sort of heaved a sigh of relief, settled back, put their hands on their laps and then listened to what I said about why the law was wrong.
Mr. Lucas, despite his conservative nature, both in temperament and politics, was an early supporter of the society.
September 12th, 1963. I had a telephone chat today with a young lady who is an assistant to the Homosexual Law Reform Society's secretary. She spoke very freely, dangerously so, I thought, since she's not ever met me and could not be certain of my bona fides, and told me that Mr. Field, the MP that came to grief in 1953, had lost his position so completely that he had to become a tobacconist and newsagent, and was now doing well. I was surprised to learn that his conviction for importuning had shattered his career so entirely. The lady told me that there are very many people in distress, many of them suicidal, that call on the Society for help. The vicars of Camberwell and Kingston have volunteered to provide assistance to these, and had done much good in soothing and comforting the unhappy queens sent to them. It's a pity, though no surprise, that no Catholic priests do the same. November 19th, 1963, Tuesday. Tonight's Homosexual Law Reform Society's lecture was given by Leo Apsey, the Labour MP for Pontypool, who introduced the bill last year. At the very end of the meeting, a little white-headed, pippin-faced man rose to ask if Mr. Absey and other members were aware that there were numerous male prostitutes standing around Piccadilly Circus Underground every night, and if not, should they not be informed? I felt rather indignant, but later on, walking to Piccadilly Circus through the Mall, I reflected that he had probably suffered from some rent boy's violence or dishonesty and was trying to get his revenge. On the 21st of July 1967, the Sexual Offences Bill received royal assent, but it only decriminalised gay sex in England and Wales between two men over 21 and in private. Hundreds of men continued to be imprisoned for gross indecency, some trying to get treatment, searching for a supposed cure for their homosexuality. Here Mr. Lucas bears testimony to an early version of so-called conversion therapy, medical practices that aim to change a person's sexual orientation or gender identity. He writes about his friend H.D. Williams, who was prescribed a form of chemical castration similar to that experienced by the Second World War code-breaking hero and mathematical genius Alan Turing. February 2nd, 1963. To town to buy my new season ticket. This Saturday afternoon, in Piccadilly Circus Underground, I spied H.D. Williams cottaging again with some tale of doing his shopping. In a sense, I suppose he was. Poor, amiable, loquacious queen that he is. He's had nearly a year now of estrogen tablets, psychotherapy and group therapy. And because he's not had sexual intercourse in that time, he'd be recorded as cured. But he isn't, and he hasn't stopped cottaging at any rate. I wonder how many others who figure in any case studies as cured are as little altered as Williams.
Wishing and hoping and thinking and praying, planning and dreaming each night of his charms that won't get you into his arms. So if you're looking to find love, you can share. All you gotta do is hold him and kiss him and love him and show him that you care.
As the 60s progressed, away from Parliament, hair was worn longer, skirts much, much shorter. And musical tastes were changing too, not least due to the emergence of one particular popular beat combo whose music and fans were not to Mr. Lucas's tastes.
It's been a hard day's night, and I've been working like a dog.
March 5th, 1964, Thursday. The Beatles are four pleasant-voiced pop singers for whom foolish girls swoon over in crowds, as crowds always do when their idols appear. There's little good in all this adolescent nonsense. Yet Dr. Soper, the Methodist, now thunders, "If Beatlemania typifies Western society, then, with all their faults, give me the Soviets," and goes on to denounce this shock-haired quartet and their fans. Old men full of irritable envy of the young are pitiable. When they spit their venom from pulpits, they become dangerous.
Whilst the Beatles may not have been to Mr. Lucas's taste, his social life is starting to pick up.
April 4th, 1964. This evening to the first gay party I've ever been to. David Hancock's 21st birthday party, held in the ground floor flat at Tooting he occupies with a young man, Tony Clements. It was an enjoyable evening with about 10 guests, ranging downwards from about 38. Some fairly personable, others like me. Plenty of drinks, including a very nasty punch that smelled of face powder, as well as a good brown sherry. Cold snacks, continuous music, and after a while, alcohol and security produced that usual result. A good deal of mildly amorous kissing and cuddling. 3 queens doing the high-kicking chorus act, quite amusing set of camp songs from Terry Maidley, during which I caressed David for a moment. My thoughts were running all this time on Peter, even while tongue-kissing with a big queen, very camp and floppy, who was once, he said, a female impersonator at the review bar, but is now a clothier's shop assistant. It lasted till 2 the next morning. Home rather tipsy at 3:10, having walked from Tooting. July the 19th, 1968. The cherry cake I bought yesterday at Fuller's had mould on it. The fag of taking it or sending it to Fuller's bakery is too much, but I think I'll write to them.
Mr. Lucas's expenditure on cake was dwarfed by the money he spent on buying sex, as well as the many casual gifts he made to the young men he had encounters with. At the end of each year, he would record his annual accounts in his diaries. Here's his tally for 1969, totted up on New Year's Eve as the chimes of Big Ben rang across London.
Expenditure on sex in 1969 has been £59.13. No great sum, though more in earlier years. And given away to this and that young man has been £181 5 shillings and 9pence. Whether I've got my money's worth for this £59, I doubt. Rogers and Graham were the only really enjoyable young men. The £35 5 shillings and 7pence expended for charitable and religious purposes does not seem very great beside these sums.
Was Mr. Lucas exploiting young men, or did they take advantage of him? How do we view his behaviour today?
What we see is a middle-aged man preying on much younger men. So it's difficult to really give Mr. Lucas that much defence, really, or to really defend Mr. Lucas against those sort of accusations that he was simply exploiting the younger men's vulnerability. But at the same time, Mr. Lucas himself was also very vulnerable. Before 1967, he was, of course, very, very at risk of being blackmailed. Homosexuality was still against the law. He was also at risk of being beaten up, which happened quite a few times. And he was also at risk simply of exposure to friends, to family, to neighbours, to his work. So who exploited whom? If you look at the people that Mr. Lucas writes about in the diaries, they are men on the make. They are people who are part of the criminal gangs of the East End, of the West End at the time. Certainly there will be vulnerable people amongst them, but I think on balance, Mr. Lucas feels more exploited than being the exploiter.
It's interesting as well, isn't it, in terms of today's perspective, there's so much more positivity towards sex work. I mean, so much of the shame and the sting has been drawn out of it because there's been a sort of societal shift, I think. It's very apparent reading them. You get the presence of this lurking threat from these young men, but also they know what they're doing, and as you say, his own vulnerability, but also that the whole transaction now would perhaps be viewed in a slightly different way.
I think the balance of power, if you can put it like that, is certainly going to move to the younger man, 100%. If you look at male prostitution nowadays, it's absolutely it's seen in a much more positive light. But back in the day, it was a case of what else can you do? It's difficult to find work. You've just perhaps moved to London. You're young, you're unemployed. So, again, were they preyed upon by middle-aged men like Mr. Lucas? I think there's probably an element of truth in that, certainly.
What age were we talking about?
The people Mr. Lucas writes about are all over the age of 18. His young men are usually 23, 24, 25.
In 1968, Mr. Lucas will face one of the most terrifying experiences of his life. Did he, we wonder, commit a deadly act of murder? The thoughts are there in ink, and the seeds of a motive were first sown a decade earlier when Mr. Lucas falls for a young man called Peter.
I remember my second visit to Peter on 27th of March 1961, when, having got his money, he was reluctant to let me feel his penis, avoided an embrace and managed to elude more than one kiss by saying, "There's a horrible stench from your breath." This is quite understandable, of course. Anyone would find the clutching or caressing of an ageing man extremely distasteful.
Hugo Greenhalgh, what do we know of Peter?
Well, we know that Peter first arrived in London from Ireland in 1958. Little is known about his early years, but the diaries tell us that by 1960, for example, he was working as a 19-year-old rent boy, as Mr. Lucas writes, treading the pavements of Piccadilly and standing opposite Green Park, which were two notorious pickup haunts at the time. As Mr. Lucas tells us, at first, despite being disarmed by Peter's beauty, it's all about sex, and even there, neither party are particularly enjoying it.
January 23rd, 1961. It troubles me that the gay world, the homosexual world, should be forced into such proximity to the criminal. We are not criminals, and we ought to assert the fact. But the law classes us with criminals, and there is thus created a tendency for the less responsible or less reflective homosexual to imagine he has something in common with a thief or swindler or other such. Here again, we must fight a war on two fronts and with no allies. It is this that lies heavy on me when I meet Peter or any of the Dilly boys.
At age 19, we're already seeing how Peter will, I guess, morph into becoming the kind of baby gangster that he does become in the end. He is a friend of Ronnie's, as the diaries tell us, a friend of Ronnie Cray's, and becomes rather a tabloid favourite after appearing for the defence of the Cray twins in their first trial. And this is just one of the many times we get to hear about just how close Peter was to true, extreme, real violence.
And how does their relationship evolve?
It starts with money, of course, but I think there is definitely love from Mr. Lucas, and at first a deep well of affection from Peter as well. But then it moves through to hassles, other times when Mr. Lucas bumps into Peter in the square, in Trafalgar Square or Leicester Square. He's also accosted, called names, again, money's demanded, and it ends eventually in violence.
September 22nd, 1965, Wednesday. I was just about to take the first sip of coffee this morning when the doorbell sounded and my private life blew up in my face. There was Peter with a woman. "I'm moving in, George," adding with a sneer, "I know you won't mind if I get behind with the rent or come in at all hours, and my gear will be safe here." My agitation was visible and uncontrollable. I refused. Anything would be better than having my home occupied by someone of this sort. So then he dropped his smiling air and showed the vicious, slightly mad personality that he keeps so well hidden. Threatening me with a complaint to the police, he went on, "There's enough in your diaries to make a lot of charges stick. If you won't have me in your flat, I'll have you in a prison cell." Opening the sideboard drawer, he took the £8 and 10 shillings that was in it and £6 out of my wallet. I did nothing to stop him. But a thought struck him. "And we'll have the diary too, and the dirty photos you've got." But my, "No, you won't have those," didn't seem to provoke him, and he left. And all this misery, this black cloud over all the future, does not come from lechery, from any of the indiscretions that lust leads my fellow homosexuals into. It is love that has put me in this peril, the tender, pitying love for Peter that suddenly came to me last year. And I sit here tonight, still trembling, mouth dry still and heart pounding, the wireless turned down so I can hear any movement at the front door.
And Peter is also implicated in another robbery a few years later. Mr. Lucas's infatuation is causing nothing but trouble. There is a question mark hovering over whether Mr. Lucas, timid and meek by nature, might have been riled to murder Peter himself. The diaries certainly indicate a desire.
Desperation gives boldness to timid men, and my conscientious scruples over cutting short another human life are greatly diminished, for there is no other way of preserving my life, my goods, my daily life, from invasion, disturbance and destruction. I could kill him if I was sudden. He'd not be on his guard with me, and knife or string about his throat should finish him. Disposing of his dead body is the chief problem, but I live by myself and I could huddle it up in a wardrobe till I got a metal trunk. If I were not moving, there'd be no need for that, as the body could go under the floorboards in the hall. I don't know how fast decomposition is, but a metal container should keep in the stench of his corrupting flesh, so much sweeter than his corrupted life, and it must pass off in time. The danger would be if he told any of his vile cronies where he was going. I must satisfy myself on that point before coming behind him with knife or cord. If he hasn't, and it's not likely so sly creeping a creature would, his disappearance from his usual haunts, as the phrase goes, should not cause any inquiries to come to my door. December 2nd, 1968, Monday. On the corner of York Place, Michael Luke greeted me, now a supervisor of vacuum cleaner salesman and still living with David Jackson. He mentioned Irish Peter with some disgust. My spirits lightened considerably when Luke said he'd heard from a man knowledgeable in the shady, sordid doings of the West End that Irish Peter has been killed and his body dumped in concrete, taken a ride in a ready-mix trailer for trying to blackmail an unscrupulous and ruthless peer. This is too good to be true, of course, but it would greatly ease my mind to know that a malignant spirit is put out of the world and gone to his own place, where their worm dieth not, and their fire is not quenched. The diaries are unclear on what happened to Peter. Do we know what happened to him, Hugo? Is he in fact still alive today, or did he meet an untimely end?
Do you think there's a chance he was murdered?
Yes, quite frankly, which sounds rather gruesome, but he was a very close associate of the Krays. Just the crowd he moved in, the people he ran with, as it were. There's a very, very distinct chance that he met a very, very dodgy end. We also know that from the diaries, Mr. Lucas was keeping a very keen eye on the developments and the course of the trials of the Kray twins.
These Krays seem a very perfect type of the London working-class man. Viciously amoral, naturally dishonest, casually cruel, cunning but not intelligent, greedy for money and grabbing it by any means. The fouler the better.
More than 100 detectives of London's regional crime squad and of the fraud squad carried out the arrests in a series of raids which began just before dawn this morning. Among the first to be brought in were the 34-year-old Kray twins, Reginald and Ronald, and their brother Charles Kray. They were found in the 9th floor flat in a skyscraper block which is occupied by their mother just off Old Street.
The three Kray brothers have been charged with 4 other men with helping Frank Mitchell to escape from Dartmoor. They later appeared in court at Bow Street.
October 15th, 1968. The committal proceedings against the monstrous Kray brothers continue to unfold a catalogue of bloody crimes, episodes of fraud, extortion and torture, interspersed with callous and carefully arranged murders, all against a background of slovenly affluence in council flats and rented rooms, liquor and parties in which murderers drank and joked with victims and accomplices, but forever in need of more and seemingly without any human feelings at all, only their simulacra.
March 17th, 1969. It's not often that the scurrilously unfunny private eye pokes fun at a deserving butt. This week, though, its front cover cartoon shows the two Krays, with Reginald inquiring, "Are you appealing?" and Ronnie replying, "Better ask my friends in high places, ducky." Ronnie Kray's homosexual propensities will damage his standing far more than his monstrous bloody murders and extortions. So coarsely debased are the common people. But if calling him a fat puff, as one of his victims is now said to have done, will stop him becoming a romantic hero, then let him be.
Hugo, looking back, what do you find so intriguing about Mr. Lucas's character?
Many, many things. But for me, he's a mixture of the heroic and the tragic. I mean, heroic in the fact that he lived a life, again, relatively openly as a gay man back in the 40s, 50s and 60s. But also the tragedy of his life is that he met nobody. He lived alone. He had several great loves that came to nothing, in fact, almost ruined him. But was he a victim of his own sexuality or the way in which society treated gay and bisexual men at that time? That's the heroism for me, the fact he kept on going. He talks in the diaries incessantly about suicidal thoughts, about how his life is miserable. But as a diarist, he was there. He recorded what he saw and what he did, and let's face it, who he did. But it was also important that he kept on going. And I think at base it ruined him, but it also made him a better diarist. Through his misery, we found out more about society than if he'd been perhaps a little happier. But yes, a mixture of heroism and tragedy.
I love the sort of Pooter meets Orton quality to it. There's such a wonderful banality and then some really racy, dangerous stuff mixed in. And then this, at the base of it, a kind of strange conservatism about the Queen and about society. It's really intriguing, isn't it?
That's the wonderful thing. He is the arch conservative, and yet he's out kind of cottaging in public loos or rummaging around the loos in Raphael Park. So you've got this strange mixture of somebody who's very buttoned up, literally, in his kind of three-piece suit, but also buttoned up also in terms of his attitudes. And yet, when it comes to gay rights, when it comes to supporting the march towards equality, he was there. He was never on the barricades, but he did go to the meetings. He did kind of put himself forward. And when you read his diaries, he was always very clear that he was and still lived as a gay man.
I've just recently lost my father, unfortunately, and I was going through the loft and a very similar feeling of sorting through the ephemera of someone's life and realising what just gets neglected or thrown away and what survives. And I mean, in this instance of Mr. Lucas, there's this incredible archive. But what appeals to me is the strange mixture of the banal and the profound. Anyone could have found a diary like this belonging to a relative, perhaps, and just sorted through it. And then the extraordinary thing about this, for me as a gay man, is the parallel life that's being lived, this extremely conventional civil servant, looking almost too like a kind of centrally cast civil servant, would have been played by Richard Gatiss in a film in the 50s.
December 31st, 1969, Wednesday. A bitter cold day, powdery snow driven before a biting east wind. Out to dinner at 8 o'clock, with many young fellows on the train bound for the West End to see the New Year. After dinner, I saw very many gathering in Trafalgar Square, and the usual street vendors beginning to do a trade in comic hats and squeakers. I was home again by 10:15 to listen to a watch night service from Bangor. Drank a glass of curacao as Big Ben chimed out 1969 and chimed in 1970. The last years of each decade have been pivotal for me, and now 1969 sees me moved into a Clapham Park flat. In those 10 years, changes have been many. Television is now as much a part of daily life as electric light, and its influence bad. Everywhere is sex, nudity, frankness. All of the old reticences are gone, or almost gone, and the general mood of the country is one of feverish frivolity. The whole character and spirit of the Wilson administration is implicit in the MBEs given to the sniggering, mannerless Beatles, the OBE for Mary Quant, the fashion designer whose life's ambition is to devise a costume that will enable women to expose their pudenda as they walk and sit.
Oh, how they fill my eyes.
The sexual life of London, the gay world, has changed enormously. When I moved to Brixton, there were 4 public lavatories around Clapham North. Now there are none. No place where the homosexually inclined may indicate their inclination and discover like-minded partners. Marble Arch, once the grand open-air meeting place, is dead. The public houses and coffee bars nearby demolished. Its thronging guardsmen and Irish layabouts vanished. What is left is a few rent boys and a handful of guardsmen in the West End, a few household cavalry troopers in a Knightsbridge bar, a gaggle of pansy young men in Earl's Court. The legalisation of homosexual intercourse in 1967 has been a relief to me personally, but has come at a time when the opportunities of such intercourse are lessening. What in the 1950s would have been the open sesame to a treasure house has unlocked the door of Mother Hubbard's cupboard. Now, at the end of the decade, I fear that my capacity for sexual enjoyment is beginning to be withered at its source. I am like someone who has longed to taste the sweet fruits of some orchard, but found the gates locked and keepers patrolling, so that it was only windfalls that came his way, so delicious sweet that he would sometimes dare dogs and keepers and poised perilously on the orchard wall, reach in and grasp some apple or plum from the nearest trees. But at last, after years of squabble and contention, the orchard is thrown open, and he passes through the gates to find the trees dying, strangled in mistletoe and ivy, the fruits few, crabbed and sour, or else succulent enough, ripe and exuding juice, but almost tasteless. All the old remembered tang and sweetness gone.
What a beautiful passage that is. I know how he feels. Wow, that's amazing.